As probably you all know, this person over there doesn't need any introduction. This person over here does not need some introduction. I'm Bill Taubman's friend. I have been his friend for 40 years. He's the one who hired me, who called, and he first spoke with Susan. When we were in Baltimore, I wanted to know how to pronounce my last name. And I said, oh, here it goes, my job. So when I spoke with Bill on the phone, I said, well, pronounce it any way you want. He insisted on pronouncing it correctly. So I gave him one of my 3 correct pronunciations of my last name. He still has it. My name is Pavel Machala, and I came 10 years later in 1977. So Bill has been here for 50 years now. And so it's a big anniversary. His second major book on a second major figure in Soviet history. And Bill has been also an amazing colleague, teacher, and scholar. Some of my colleagues are great in one or the other. I'm in neither. But Bill managed to transcend the boundaries of teaching and research and managed to do so effortlessly. Those of you who know how Bill writes, you know it's always a pleasure to read his works. I have learned so much from him. I have always been amazed about his wisdom. And more importantly, I always was amazed how patient he is in producing major works. This first work on Khrushchev was a bestseller, not only in English, but in other languages, including Czech. I had to import some copies there. I did it freely. And the second book I read 3 times. First as a draft, which I forgot to finish. So by the time I wanted to finish it, I told Bill I'm on the way to finishing. He said, don't bother, I have a new draft. So I read the second draft. And finally, just over the last 5 days, I read this final version, which is stunning. It's even better than what I thought was the last draft I read. Bill, congratulations.
Thank you.
But more importantly, let me quiz you first. You know I'm a stickler and sucker for footnotes or endnotes. Do you know how many endnotes you have in your book?
No.
Guess.
900?
No.
1,500?
More.
2,000?
More.
2,500?
A little bit less. 2,300. 2,300 footnotes. Endnotes.
Are you trying to hold down sales?
I should probably, because there are 50, well, how many? Quite over 80 pages of footnotes or endnotes, you know. So yes, it's heavier as a result of your endnotes, but it's heavier for purpose. You know, those of you, and I'm one of those idiots, those of you who will read, who would insist on following the endnotes, you will learn far more because you will see, you will understand the voices, you will imagine graduate individuals who are making those observations. And so the book begins to be, at least for me, far more meaningful with those over 2,000 endnotes that you did not know that you had.
I'm going to break in with something that Jane, my wife, who taught here for many years, teaching Russian at Amherst, and I, these days we're working on, not so much, we're not doing the Russian translation, but there are 2 translators in Moscow who are working on it. And they are asking me to give them, insofar as I can, the Russian originals that I translated into English, so that rather than retranslating them back, they can print them. And I, unfortunately, was not smart enough to save all of those original Russian things. Now, it's okay if they're in books, because my multiple footnotes, as Pavel says, will take them back to the books where they can find a lot of the original quotes. But a lot of things come out of interviews that I did, mostly with Jane, with Gorbachev himself, and a lot of other people, friends, allies, adversaries, relatives. And I have the texts of those, but that's not easy. I have to go through all of these texts looking for a line here, a line there. And of course, people in an interview are often rambling, and there's a lot of and this and that, the equivalent of that in Russian. So I have to clean it up in Russian, I think, although this is a philosophical question. Do they get quoted as they said it or as it would be polished? So this is just a tangent really having to do with footnotes and Russian and problems involved in writing a book like this.
Well, another good reason to have endnotes, footnotes in important books, that people can trace the origin, not only your thoughts, but the original untranslated text on which you are depending. Speaking of untranslated text, I know that the book is in the process of being translated into Russian, as you just reminded us, but therefore Mikhail Gorbachev hasn't read it yet.
I sent him a copy.
In English?
What?
This copy?
No. Yes, of course. I sent him a copy, and I heard back from the woman who's the executive director of his foundation, and we dealt with a lot in working on this. And she said he congratulates you at dushi, from the heart, and he looks forward to reading it in Russian once it's translated, and once he does, he looks forward to giving you his впечатления, his impressions. And that's a nice neutral word. I spend a fair amount of time imagining his впечатления and what they might be.
Actually, I was going to ask you, what do you think is going to be Gorbachev's response, reaction, впечатления, towards your book? Is he going to love it, hate it?
Neither, I think. I think anybody who's having his or her biography written, just imagine, any of you, somebody comes along to write your biography and asks you to tell them everything you can and provide them with everything you can and interviews your friends and your relatives and all the rest, and you wonder, what is this person writing? What's he going to say or she say in the end? And probably it's inevitable that it's not exactly what you would wish them to say. So I think it's inevitable he will be disappointed in some of the things in it. On the other hand, there are people in this room, whom I won't name, who've read it and think I'm too nice, too soft on him. And then there are people who think I'm too hard on him. So I have tried to be objective. Now that word is a tricky word these days. Can anyone be objective? What does it mean? Aren't we all subjective? But as best I can, as hard as I tried to tell it objectively. And I hope he appreciates that. Well, I think he will. I think he will, but he'll still have reservations.
Well, let me make a prediction. He will love your book. Just remember, just before we came to this hall, you wondered how many people will come. I said we're full. It's full.
That's not going to predict his reaction. In fact, Pavel, your being from Czechoslovakia originally puts you geographically and even politically within what used to be called the Soviet camp, although you never were entirely
I lived there.
Okay, and I don't want to say Russians are different, because there is no such thing really as national character anyway. But Gorbachev, in his own country, has been subject to slings and arrows without end, both while he was in power and ever since. He is despised by probably, although I haven't measured it, the great majority of his own people. It's so bad that his daughter, to whom he is devoted, as he was to his wife, and relied on both of them while his wife was alive and then on his daughter after Raisa died. She has actually spends most of her time now in Germany, partly because of medical issues involving her husband, but partly because she, I believe, couldn't take it anymore. So for a man who's had that much insult and enmity, I think he probably wants and needs praise. And I praise him a lot, but maybe not enough.
Well, I hope that you will judge. I do think that you praise him, that you in a very balanced and very profound way. That's why I love your book so much. It shows depiction of a world historical figure. You call him a tragic hero. And you end actually the book, the last sentence in your book refers to Gorbachev as a tragic hero who deserves our understanding and admiration. This is a profound and powerful statement with which you finish.
But I know since we just had dinner together that you have doubts
about
the word tragic.
I disputed. Bill and I we began our conversation 2 hours ago at Formosa, and we.
It's amazing we have anything left to say.
Well, we do have plenty of say. I have quite a few questions for you, and I wanted. I was a little bit uncomfortable with that last sentence because I thought it was unnecessarily modest or describing not Gorbachev sufficiently deeply, because the rest of the book suggests that Gorby tried impossible and failed at impossible.
Pavel's position in this Formosa conversation was that if he tried to achieve the impossible and failed, that's not tragic, because it was predictable, I suppose. I'm not sure that's comfort to the person who tries it, and I know in Gorbachev's case it wasn't comfort, but I also think it's tragic not only because of the forces he faced, which overwhelmed him in the end, but because his failure, or insofar as it was a failure in the end, was partly the result of his own flaws. And in that sense, he's a tragic figure. And that then raises the question of what those flaws were. And that drew me in the book to an attempt to describe his character, his personality. And it's complicated. I do the best I can. But I think the thing that leapt out at me was his confidence, his overconfidence that he could do what, in retrospect, looks to many people to be impossible. And then there were various tactical errors he made along the way, which also reflected his overconfidence. One of them was the sense that the cardline communists, whom he was trying to bring along with him, by hook or by crook, by persuasion or discipline of the Communist Party, that they had no choice but to follow him because they were lost without him. And up to the very moment of the attempted coup against him in August 1991, he thought they wouldn't do it or couldn't do it, when there were all kinds of warnings he got, including from Matlock, the American ambassador, that it was coming. So he underestimated them and overestimated his ability to handle them. And similarly, he overestimated his ability to handle Yeltsin, who was the one who brought him down in the end. He thought Yeltsin was a pain, a difficult person, in some ways not unlike the orange-haired president of a certain country, although of course he didn't know that at the time. But it turned out that Yeltsin outfought him. So in these tactical ways, as well as in this overarching strategic sense that he could democratize Russia, he was overconfident. And one more thing about this, therefore, when things began to fall apart, it had a devastating effect on him as a character. And that, in turn, led him to make mistakes, which deepened his troubles. So I think he's a tragic figure in that personal sense, as well as in the result, which might have been impossible to begin with.
Bill, you know very well that I don't normally read biographies. I am not into personalities and psychology of individuals, statesmen, politicians. I like to think in larger categories, like mode of production, ruling class.
Mode of production, I've heard that before.
Class interest,
yes.
And other similar terms that, for which I don't need to know individuals, even amazingly important historical figures, because I often see them as the vehicles of the historical forces, a reflection of the times that into which they were suited to be key actors. But I always admired your ability to convince me that I'm wrong about underestimating individuals in studying in politics. And I worried that you were right. But I wonder whether you would agree with me that this overconfidence that you see him as somehow contributing to his tactical mistakes, not strategic mistakes, is due in part, if not probably to a greatest degree, to his early childhood. You know, I'm now going where I would never go. I couldn't care less about childhood. But I wonder whether because you start really with his upbringing and and I wonder whether the source of the tragedy that you say was not his mother.
I avoid that kind of conclusion at all costs. I don't consider myself a psychobiographer in the sense that I'm not a psychologist, but I'm an amateur, having taught about 10 years with a member of the Amherst Psychology Department, Amy Demarest, an expert on personality. We taught a course called Personality and Political Leadership, and we tried to understand leaders. And one of the things I learned in that course animated me in this endeavor, and that is that not all leaders are the same. Some leaders have more power than others, and some leaders you can say more than you can about others, that you sense that their personality is driving what they do with their power. And I think Gorbachev is a classic example. He is the leader, after all, of a totalitarian, or shall we call it post-totalitarian system, and as such he has tremendous power when he comes in 1985 to do good or evil. And then the second very important thing is what he chooses to do is unique. Nobody else in his leadership group, very few people in the whole elite, would have tried to do what he tried to do. So you have to ask yourself the question, why did he try to do this? And you have to wonder the extent to which it reflected his character, and I think it did. He was an idealist. He was a dreamer in a way. He was a liberal, very rare, if not entirely unheard of, at the top of the Soviet system. Well, how did he get to be such a person? Then you go back, as Pavel suggested I did. You go back to his childhood and you try to figure out how he became the man, how he became the gravedigger of the Soviet system. And what you discover is, you discover many things, and I won't try to sum them up. After all, you're here to buy the book. I take that back. But he grows up a kind of golden boy in a Soviet village. He's a terrific student. All the girls like him. His teachers love him. He breaks records at the harvest using a combine with his father. He gets a medal, the second highest medal in the Soviet Union, the Medal of the Red Labor Banner. He goes off to the university. He's greeted as a kind of country bumpkin, but he turns out to have a brain, and he becomes a kind of intellectual. And then he goes back to Stavropol, which is the city nearest where he grew up, and all the other people there who are working along with him in the parties are Zhlubs, and he stands out. So what I'm trying to say is that from the beginning, until the moment he crashes and burns, he has almost nothing but success. He is lionized in his own country and around the world. He's viewed as the most popular man in the Soviet Union and a great world statesman. And then suddenly things fall apart. And if he doesn't handle things falling apart as well as he should, it's partly because he has expected too much. And therefore, their failure to work out in the way that he wants is crushing. And I think, so what I'm saying is that both the aspiration to do what he wanted to do and then the troubles he runs into and the way he copes with those troubles all are, in a way, a reflection of his character. And that's why a biography of such a person is so tempting to try to do.
It's interesting because in one of your concluding chapters, either you or someone else asked Gorbachev whether he's happy. And he says that he is happy. And you wonder whether he's telling you the truth or whether he's telling the truth. How can a tragic hero be happy after the tragedy? But based on what you just said, I wonder whether it doesn't make perfect sense for someone who had such confidence about himself, as you described, in youth, childhood youth, as a young apparatchiks, and then member of the political elites of the Soviet state. Whether it's not normal for someone who continue to exude optimism, would continue to exude optimism even after he failed in impossible.
Once in a while, he describes himself as too self-confident. In fact, there's a passage which I came upon rather late in my research, but to which I attributed a lot of importance. It's at the end of the introduction, which is kind of short, and he says, I say, whatever term one uses, Gorbachev was extraordinarily sure of himself. But when asked what characteristics he found most off-putting in another person to whom he has just been introduced, he answered, self-confidence. And what in general irritated him most in other people, haughtiness. And then I wrote, did he feel threatened by other self-assured men? Men, because in the Soviet Politburo there were no women. Or did he see himself in others and not like what he saw? And in the course of the book, I come upon moments where I think I see doubt and insecurity sort of glinting against the background of this confidence and this overconfidence. But the way he describes himself most often when asked about himself is, he says, I'm an optimist. And so there is a certain plausibility to what you're saying. And I think he probably has mostly convinced himself that he is happy, even after everything that went wrong, and even after all of the hatred for him that he's encountered in his own country, and even after his daughter has mostly moved to Germany. I think he's probably convinced himself that he's happy, just as he convinced himself that he could succeed in transforming Russia and democratizing it in 5 or 6 years. But in a way, there must be, under the surface of that confidence and optimism, there must be a kind of aching sense that things have not ended well.
Interesting that you say so, because just a few days ago you wrote a little piece published in Washington Post titled, Why Gorbachev Likes Putin More Than You Might Expect. And when I read that article, I said, did I forget what Bill said in the first draft? Is this a departure from what you devoted your time to? And then when I read the book and came to the concluding 2 chapters, I realized that you are saying the same thing about Putin that you already say in this article published a few days ago in Washington Post. That Putin actually, that Gorbachev actually has high esteem of of Putin. You quote someone referring you refer to an article in which Gorbachev is being quoted as saying that Putin belongs into three of the most important statesmen of this current era. One of them being Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Vladimir Putin. And so I wonder whether actually, if you forgive me, whether actually this view that Gorbachev holds of Putin doesn't also suggest that Gorbachev himself has reason to be happy and optimistic, because despite the fact that he himself personally failed, his story goes on, and Putin represents merely a slower version of the march of Russian history towards democracy and decency that Gorbachev himself hoped to.
I certainly don't see it that way, I don't think he sees it that way, even though I think this is another example of his convincing himself of something about which at some level he has doubts. I go back first of all to the fact that I think he hungers for respect of his country's president, since so many of its citizens seem to have no respect for him. Jane and I went to his 75th birthday party, Gorbachevs, some years ago, 11 years ago now, I guess, in Moscow. It was in a quite nice banquet hall on a big avenue, and there were a fair number of important Russians there, mostly his former colleagues and friends. A couple of months before, Yeltsin had had his 75th birthday party at the Kremlin with Putin as the toastmaster. So I think Gorbachev not only craves respect, but I think he wants to preserve his influence. He's 86 years old, he's frail, but he still is a politician, and he wants to try to advise, insofar as the president will listen, advise the president. But beyond that are the larger issues that you raise, and I think Gorbachev learned a lesson from what happened under him, which is Russia Russia was not ready for what he had hoped it would be, a process of rapid democratization. Well, if it wasn't ready, what was the alternative? Well, the first alternative was chaos under Yeltsin, who was the president for most of the 1990s. And after chaos, Gorbachev thought it needed a certain amount of strong hand rule of the kind that Putin was going to give it. And so Gorbachev endorsed him in the 2000 election for president, and he said, and it's in my book, that Russia needs a certain amount of authoritarianism. Not too much, but a certain amount. And then he was asked, do you think Putin is basically a Democrat? And he said, I believe he is. I think he misjudged Putin. Turned out Putin was not. And Gorbachev's opinions expressed over time registered Putin's change. He became very critical of Putin, said some very lacerating things about Putin and his politics and his party. But even now, as late as April 1917, he was asked whether he still trusts Putin by a German newspaper, and he said, yes, I still do. So he has learned a lesson. He does believe it's going to take time. He's even said it might take as much as the whole 21st century for Russia to become democratic. He has quoted Moses, saying Moses got it right when he said the Jews had to wander in the desert for 40 years to get rid of the legacy of Egyptian slavery. So Gorbachev has been sobered up by what happened. But I don't think that's the same. Whoops. That can't be Putin, can it? No.
I don't think so.
But I don't think that's the same thing as quite the same thing as saying that he has decided that things have worked out well after all.
No, I don't mean to say that, but I'm just using your words.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the concluding chapters, you actually quote Gorbachev saying that there is glasnost in Putin's Russia, that glasnost is not dead. And Putin and Gorbachev then suggests that compared to the period of Brezhnev era, there is more freedom in Russia, and therefore measured by these larger historical yardsticks, for Gorbachev, Putin doesn't represent disaster that followed his demise as leader of the Soviet Union, but use a term that I like to use when I have no idea what else I'm saying, dialectical continuity.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think the image we have in the United States about Putin's Russia is too bleak. I mean, the situation there is bleak in many ways for many people, but you can still travel, which you couldn't do freely under Brezhnev. There still is at least one newspaper, which Gorbachev actually co-owns, Novaya Gazeta, which speaks its mind openly. There's at least one radio station, Echo Moskvy, Echo of Moscow, which is able to dissent. There are other ways in which it is easier, well, economically, of course, it's much easier now for people than it was under Brezhnev, although as a result of sanctions and the dropping price of oil and gas, it's gotten harder. So I think we have to remember that, and I have to say, this is not as an expert on Gorbachev, but just as an American citizen. When Congress, people in our Congress preface every mention of Putin's name with the word thug or murderer, I shrink back, because even though he may deserve some of that, I don't think he's quite that ogre. And furthermore, I don't think you do business, if you want to try to do business with a leader of another great country, by prefacing every mention of his name as thug and murderer. Forgive me for a little bit of extracurricular politicking. Maybe we should think pretty soon, Pavel, of opening it up.
Yeah, I was going to selfishly talk forever. I have so many questions, but I realized that this is your show. And so I would just ask one more question. Sure. And that links to what we have talked, what you said about Putin. Gorbachev not only is not as harsh on Putin as some others have been, and as some people would think that he should be if he were honest with himself, but he's very harsh on the West. He's very harsh on the Americans, on George Bush, first Bush. He is very harsh on how he was betrayed by the Western leaders who lionized him, who were, I'm only quoting what you say in the book, who were praising him, but as Gorbachev in your book says, they were just taking him to the cleaners. They were trying to weaken Russia, according to Gorby himself. He's disappointed that the world, the new thinking didn't blossom into form of Wilsonian universal Kantian peace, two big names in one sentence, that the world continues to be driven by geopolitics and narrow power political interest, that the United States became a unipolar actor. He resents that as much as Putin, the America's hegemony in the world. So I wonder whether actually the Gorbachev that you write about has not learned his lesson, that he not only tried impossible, but he trusted not only trusted Russian public, which seemingly suggests that Russian public has to go to several generations before he can enter the promised land, but they also trusted the Western leaders who promise a lot and deliver.
Yeah, I see where you're going, and in a way it leads back to the point which you didn't quite make, but I think you were heading there at the end, which is that one of the reasons he might admire Putin is he has come to think that for dealing with the West, a man like Putin may be necessary, and that his own, Gorbachev's own approach of counting on the West, believing in the West, trying to join the West, which he actually tried to do physically, wanting to be part of the West, was rejected by the West. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the book. And there are really two phases here. One is 1989, when Bush has just come in, the first Bush, and the other is 1990-91. 1989 was the moment, I think, when Bush and his people, Cheney, Scowcroft, Gates, made a mistake. Reagan, you will remember, at the end of 1988, or even before that, in Moscow in the summer, asked in the shadow of the Kremlin, do you still view Russia, Soviet Union as an evil empire? Said, no, that was another era, another time. Reagan embraced Gorbachev and what he was doing. And Bush told Gorbachev when they met on Governor's Island in New York City at the end of 1988, Reagan, Gorbachev, and Bush, that he was going to pick up where Reagan had left off. There's even a moment where he says to Gorbachev at that moment, I better do it, because if I don't, Reagan's going to be on the phone from California telling me, what are you doing? Pick up the pace. But then Bush comes in as president, and he calls a halt, a pause. He declares a pause in U.S.-Soviet relations so he can reassess what's been going on. And this is because the people around him are telling him Gorbachev is a smiley-faced communist. He sounds nice, he smiles, but he's not to be trusted. He's not the real thing. Well, in the book, I try to argue that by that time they should have known he was the real thing. He was on his way out of Afghanistan. There had been elections, or about to be elections, for a genuine parliament, mostly free elections. He was cutting back troop levels all around in Europe. But nonetheless, they stiffed Gorbachev for half of 1989. And there was no summit following on the three that Reagan had had in rapid succession until the very end of 1989. This was a moment when Gorbachev could have used and expected to get the support that he had been promised, and he really didn't get it. Now, after that, Bush came around, and they met many times, and Bush openly and warmly and enthusiastically endorsed what Gorbachev was doing, and Gorbachev himself, and that won Gorbachev over. But then at the end, in 1990 and 1991, Gorbachev wanted money. He was really hoping for a Marshall Plan to help Russia, and Bush was the one who kiboshed it. Some of the Germans might have been willing. They did a lot, and they would have done more. The French would have done more. The British would have done more. The Japanese held back because of the dispute about the Northern Islands, which we won't go into. But Gorbachev didn't get the money he wanted, and the main thing that happened was Germany, the reunification of Germany, and Gorbachev's acquiescence in its being a member of NATO. The West didn't expect that to happen. They were stunned, actually, when Gorbachev agreed to all of this. Gorbachev thought he had a promise from James Baker, the Secretary of State, that if he agreed, NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And as we all know, it expanded thousands of miles, all the way to the Baltic borders of Russia. Maybe that's not thousands, certainly hundreds. And potentially into Ukraine and Georgia, which we talked about doing, although it hasn't happened. So all of this has made Gorbachev angry in retrospect. And that anger is probably fueled in part by his sense that he was taken for a ride, and he allowed himself to be taken for a ride. So that's his anger, and it may very well account for some of his feeling that if Putin is giving the West a hard time, the bastards deserve it.
On that note,
so I'm from China, and it's really interesting to hear about the Russian side of things. And my friends and I...
Forgive me for moving in on you, but this is what happens in old age, yes.
We came here like half an hour early to hear you talk.
Yes.
And so my question is, like, I've always wondered how essential is Gorbachev's role in dismantling Soviet Union. And if he had never come into power, would there just be another idealist like him to replace him? How inevitable is?
Could you hear that, everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I guess I have a worse problem than I thought.
And also, I guess a related.
Yes.
I guess another related issue is like how do you know how he felt about the alternative path China is taking?
Okay.
Could you repeat
Well-
the question?
Oh yeah.
How central was Gorbachev to what happened? And if he hadn't been the Soviet leader, where would the Soviet Union be today? Or would there be a Soviet Union and what would it be like, right?
Right.
This is another one of these counterfactual questions or calling forth speculation as to what would have happened. I think most people who look at it, most experts, quote unquote, believe that if he hadn't tried to carry out the radical reforms that he did, the Soviet Union could have lasted for another 10, 15, 20, who knows, 25 years. It would have probably looked more or less like the Brezhnev years, which in retrospect, a lot of Russians think was, if not a golden age, then at least a better time than Gorbachev brought them, or Yeltsin brought them. But I think most people would also think, well, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people would also think that at some point, the Soviet Union would have crashed. And it would have crashed differently from the way it did under Gorbachev. It would have crashed more like Yugoslavia, with a kind of all-out, no-holds-barred war between Russia and Ukraine, for example, resembling the Serbs and the Croats. It might have looked like Romania, where in the end, you know, they hung Ceausescu and his wife, and there was a kind of bloodbath. So that's the way the speculation goes. Who knows? But he certainly was crucial, because if he hadn't been there, and they tried to get rid of him in 1991, they would have turned back the clock to where it was when he came in, with moderate changes. Now, the second question was, what does Gorbachev think of the Chinese?
Of the alternative.
I haven't talked to him about that recently. I know he was, as you may remember, in Beijing at the time of Tiananmen Square, and he was horrified, although he didn't say so publicly. And I think the spectacle of what happened there while he was in the city, the crushing of that demonstration and of the Chinese democratic movement, encouraged him to accept, without attempting to crush, the democratic movement in Eastern Europe, which was occurring at about the same time, 1989. So it had that immediate effect. But I don't know exactly what he would say today about the Chinese. Any other questions? Yes? Well,
How different was it writing about a living figure than writing about Khrushchev?
how different was it writing about Gorbachev as compared to Khrushchev? There were advantages and disadvantages to me as a biographer in both cases. In the case of Khrushchev, the disadvantage was that a lot of people were dead. The advantage was that the people who were still alive were willing to talk openly and candidly. In the case of Gorbachev, a lot more people were alive, but some of them were more guarded in what they said. I remember a case where I called up on the telephone in Russian a former Minister of the Interior and head of the KGB, Vadim Bakatin, and I said to him in Russian, I'm an American professor writing a biography of Gorbachev, and I'm wondering whether you would have the time and the interest for me to be interviewed by me. And his answer was, I have the time, but not the interest. And I'll compare this, actually, it doesn't quite fit my comparison, but in the case of Khrushchev, I found in the year 1999, maybe it was even 2000, the man who'd been the head of the KGB at the time Khrushchev was ousted in October 1964. And I called him up on the telephone, And I asked him the same question, although I didn't say time and interest. I said, would you be willing to be interviewed? And he said, will you pay me $250? It was a bad time, and I paid him $250. And I got some nice cookies and tea out of it as well. Yes?
Hi, should I come closer?
Yes, please.
That's okay, I'll try to speak up for everyone. You were raising the question about readiness for democracy, especially in the context of Russia, and you said that it might take the entirety of the 21st century. My boyfriend, who is Russian, and I speak about that a lot, and we sort of have this hypothesis that what makes a country ready for democracy is essentially a level of grassroots involvement. So things like in America that people sit on school boards, and that in schools you have student government, and all of those kind of things that almost get people in the habit of thinking democratically, and that then build the foundation for a democracy. But I was wondering what your thoughts are. Like, what are the missing pieces that make Russia ready for democracy, and when or how might they be achieved?
Good question. In the late 19th century, after centuries of czarist rule, they began to develop the beginnings of a kind of civic life and civic culture. There were zemstvos, as they were called. People began within limits to participate. They even, after the 1905 revolution, had a parliament called the Duma, which it's called now, which Nicholas II allowed, but then limited. And then, of course, came the revolution, and came Stalinism, and came totalitarianism, and all of this was brought to an end. It got to the point where it was even dangerous to whisper in an apartment what you were really thinking with a telephone covered to prevent it from being overheard. It got to the point where you could be denounced by friends and neighbors and even occasionally relatives for things you had said or even hadn't said if they wanted to get your apartment after you were picked up and purged in the middle of the night. So it was only, slowly, to some minimal degree under Brezhnev. You could talk a little bit more if you kept your nose clean. There was no arbitrary terror. They arrested people who were critical and dissenters, but not people who kept their mouth shut. Then under Gorbachev, not everything, but almost everything became possible. It took people a long time to get used to it, to believe that they could do it and it wouldn't be punished for it. They began to do it. I had a student here, whom I won't name, who wrote a wonderful thesis about, in effect, in that period, the beginnings of a civic culture and interest groups, in effect, and all the kinds of things that you're talking about. And this continued to some extent under Yeltsin, maybe even expanded. But now they're sort of back, not to Stalin, not even entirely to Brezhnev, as I was saying, but there are NGOs, but Putin passed a law that NGOs who accept money from outside have to declare themselves to be foreign agents, a terrible term because that was used about people who were arrested and liquidated in the 30s. So you're right, and I had hopes in the beginning because I read every speech of Putin's early on, and I had another student who wrote a thesis about Putin and read all of his speeches too. And you could see that he was paying lip service to this idea. And my thought at that time was that if he will allow it at the grassroots, it won't hurt him. He can control the television, he can control the press, but just allow it on environmental and other issues. And it will slowly grow and lead at some point in a way that he can tolerate, if he's still around, to greater democracy. But he's cut back on a lot of that too. What else do they need? I don't know. This really takes me beyond my subject. There are probably people in this room who are real experts on democracy and what are the social prerequisites for democracy. I see some of them. So I won't try to answer it because I see we're also coming up on the time when we are supposed to close. But we can take one more question. Maybe say we'll take two. Michael, Claire, yes?
First, Bill, I'll speak loud. First, thanks for your comments as an American citizen about not burning bridges to Moscow and Putin at this time when there's so much at stake. So I want to thank you for that. My question is this. Did Gorbachev tell you anything about Afghanistan, that his experience about Afghanistan, especially now when the U.S. is going back even deeper into Afghanistan? What were his lessons?
we didn't talk, Jane and I, to him about Afghanistan that much, in part because it was so clear in the documents I looked at. I mean, I read notes of Politburo meetings in which they talked about Afghanistan, and they said pretty early on, this is no good, this is a bad mistake, we got to get out. I even learned from somebody who was close to Gorbachev that he had a kind of to-do list when he came in March '85, and the first item on the top of the to-do list was exit Afghanistan. Of course, it gets complicated because they don't get fully out until 1989, and that whole process of realizing you need to get out, but not getting out quickly enough is very reminiscent of Vietnam. A lot of people die in the intervening years, especially Afghans, but a lot of Russian soldiers as well. We got to know a leading general in the Soviet military who'd been very active in Afghanistan, and we saw a lot of him in the early 2000s, and he was preaching to everybody he could get to listen that the United States was making the same mistake in Afghanistan that the Russians had made, the Soviets had made. And you can certainly make the case that it's still going on today. Which is not to say that if we got out, everything would be terrific. But what happens in these cases is you get sucked in, you go in, you stay in, and you can't get out.
Bill, if I may just add
Yes.
something. Since I read your book very carefully, on page 376 and 77, there's an interesting discussion that you are
Yes.
offering that takes place in the Politburo. And every Politburo member recognizes how hopeless the Soviet situation in Afghanistan is, and for the very similar reasons that both Obama and Trump insist that they have to stay. They are staying despite the fact it's hopeless, we still have to continue to be there. So page 376, 377, you have it there.
Okay. All right, last question.
Yes, what do you think the role of communists and communist ideology is in Russia today, apart from inspiring nostalgia? And
The Communist Party, I think, I'm looking around for Kostya, is the biggest party in Russia today, I think, isn't it, Kostya? Yeah. But it doesn't win elections, or at least not national elections. Putin's got it tamed. They follow his lead in parliament. Communist ideology, I think, it was dying even before the Soviet Union died, and its real hardcore adherents are probably mostly older people. It's very poignant and sad. I think it's still the case that there can be demonstrations, pro-Stalin demonstrations in Russia, where you see these old, beaten down people carrying banners praising communism and Stalin. I don't know. Am I wrong? Are there young people who are communists? No. So communism is not the problem today. There are lots of other problems. Okay, well, thank you guys for coming.